Hey, this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast, where we talk with some of the most successful tech leaders who reveal actionable management insights that help you take your developer team to the next level. This episode was brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.
Hello, everyone. I am Carolina Toth, and this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast. Bi-weekly, at this point, I talk with amazing tech leaders from all over the world. And today I have a guest who has been walking the ranks of the software development career ladder since at least 2005. Most recently, he was an engineering manager at Facebook. It is my pleasure to welcome Balázs. Balázs.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We've been trying to put this interview together for quite a while.
Yes.
First of all, please tell us a bit about yourself and what you're passionate about.
I've been in love with software engineering for a long time. I started programming when I was 6 years old. And I'm still fascinated by everything that's technology. So I started my professional career on the server side, but I fell in love with mobile technologies when the first iPhone came out, and I'm working on the mobile space ever since. I've been a startup junkie. Before joining Facebook, I've actually worked at 10 different startups, and I really was trying to figure out what makes a good startup really good. And I had really a lot of fun. I worked in some really amazing places. The things that you see in startups in the movies, that was all my life. So it was really fun. And then after that, I joined Facebook, which is also a really amazing place to work with. Most recently, I started to become really passionate about climate change, and I think that's kind of the biggest fight of our generation. So I really want my next 10 years to be about climate change. I want to meaningfully help to create a more sustainable, more livable world. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I don't really know in what form or shape, but that's kind of what I want to work with in the next 10 years.
Sounds like a great vision to save the world and all.
Thank you.
Today, our topic is perhaps somewhat related, perhaps not. It's knowledge sharing. And in our day and age, working in the tech industry, it is crucial to be at the forefront of new developments and acquiring new knowledge in many aspects of our lives. And to our listeners, if you guys remember, and gals, the State of Software Development 2020 report came out just around April, and if you followed it, you will know that one of the biggest challenges reported was knowledge sharing within tech teams. So today we are planning on talking about knowledge sharing and how its philosophy changed at Facebook while you were there. Let's start by talking about some of the best methods of knowledge sharing that you have encountered.
Yeah, before that, so first of all, I want to just put it out there, I'm not an expert on the topic. These are only my thoughts. I was really fortunate to work in some amazing environments, and I was able to pick the brains of so many amazing engineering leaders. So these are mainly things that I learned from them and things that I've seen that worked for me. So I just wanted to put it out before we start.
Yes, we are here for your opinion.
Sure. So before we go to the methods, I think it's worth talking a bit about the scope of knowledge sharing. And by scope, I mean how many people are you sharing this knowledge with? Because on one spectrum, I think you have your small 6 to 8 person development team, and there the goal is really to have everyone know everything about your system, and that the team members know everything about them about each other. And there are very different methods there than on the other end of the spectrum, where you have your whole company. And there, what you really want is people want to know what's happening with the company, within the company. And that's mainly about leadership transparency, and people know what's the direction, where we are heading as a company, but also what else happens elsewhere in the company. And I think as your organization grows and grows, like scaling this communication is pretty important. But this kind of like knowledge sharing requires very different tools than the knowledge sharing of the teams. And of course, in most organizations, there are in-betweens, like you have your larger teams, you have your like sub-organizations and so on. So there's a wide spectrum here, right? I think for this discussion, we will mainly focus on the small development teams and like how they share knowledge. But I think like talking a bit about the scope and thinking about the scope, it's an important aspect of this. So about the methods themselves, there are multiple methods. My way of evaluating them, basically I have two main principles around this. And one is I prefer active over passive sharing. In other words, like human interaction over like passive documentation. And the other principle I have is to be very pragmatic, whether you are evaluating any kind of methods. By the active passive, what I mean, I think documentation, like documenting something is not the same as sharing it. Documentation is passive, sharing should be an active thing. Is when multiple people like interact on a piece of information. And with that, like you don't just get the sharing itself, but you get a lot of additional things. Like as humans interact, you are going to know more about your teammates. You like as you help them, you get mutual respect, and you get to learn each other, and you build like a community, and this is how you build your team. So this is why I prefer active over passive, because it has like these very additional benefits. And the other principle, the be pragmatic, is like this applies to everything, basically, the be pragmatic. But here, every kind of knowledge sharing is going to be, it has some cost, right? So like you always need to evaluate like how much effort you put into knowledge sharing and what the value that you are getting out of that. And this will be very, very, I don't believe that there are universal, I don't know, rules or methods that should work for all teams. It really depends on your software, on your team, on your specific circumstances. So always know the why you are doing this and what you want out of that, and always evaluate the cost. So these are my two main principles when I'm looking at the methods. Back to your original question, what are the methods? I think number one for me, and I'm cheating here a bit, but it's really to create an environment where asking questions is really encouraged, and it's the norm. So create a safe environment where like everyone asks questions, and there are no stupid questions, and no one is afraid to like, oh, I should know this. And if you have that, then you're basically having a much cheaper knowledge sharing system, because people always will ask for the knowledge that they need, and you're halfway there, basically. Like you can reduce the cost of communication if you have like a fluent system like this. So I think that's number one for me. Number two is probably documentation. Like that's we cannot skip this. This is probably what pops to your mind first when we talk about knowledge sharing. I do think that documentation is overrated. I think it's probably more, this is going to be a controversial opinion, but I do think that documentation is really, really expensive. And people don't really think about the real cost of documentation when they just like, oh, we should have a documentation for everything, an amazing documentation for everything. Having really good, up-to-date documentation is much harder than people think. And the other thing is also like the documentation itself is, as we talked about, it's a passive thing. So it actually is not going to encourage that much human interaction. You should be pragmatic. There are a lot of values in documentation, and there are a lot of like places where you should have that. But I do think that in most cases it is overrated, and usually you can get away with less documentation than you actually think that you need.
All right. So if we are talking about documentation, since you mentioned that you are not that big of a fan, is there some kind of a specific process or threshold that can give our listeners a rule of thumb for the amount of written documentation a team needs?
I don't have a very good answer for that. I do have some. So I think that there are many forms of written documentation, right? So first of all, I think it depends on what kind of system are you working on, and who are your customers, and who are, like, how many people are going to touch and work with that code that you are actually doing. So as an example, one of my first teams in London, we were developing an internal system that no one is really ever going to touch. Like there were only a handful of internal customers. It was like a performance related thing. Most of the people have been there for 3 to 5 years. There were people who've been in the team for 10 years. And I was the first new joiner for a long time. I really hated that they didn't have any documentation, because like my onboarding was really difficult. But looking back and thinking about it, like having an amazing documentation there would have been a waste of effort, because I had a more difficult time onboarding, but I was the only one really. So I think this is a counterexample of like where you need documentation. On the other hand, let's think about like some of my more recent teams where we are developing libraries and we have like thousands of internal users who are using this code day to day. It's also, some of these projects are open source, so like there are way more people who are using it in the world. And they are like spending a significant time to have really good documentation. It's like that is a must. And it's not just like you should have it. It's really like a survival mechanism. So often we found ourselves that we are spending 50-60% of our time really just supporting the systems and answering questions and trying to like solve problems for other people. And that's where like you just have to create something that just kills itself, and documentation is really something that can do that. I think that's again, like there are different kinds of documentations that you can do. I do think that there are a few things that every project should have. So I think you should always write down your decisions that you made and like how you made those decisions. And like if you do any kind of research, like you should document that. If you have like principles for your architecture, these things should be captured somewhere. It doesn't have to be like an amazing detailed design document, but it should be captured somewhere. These are the things that can be lost, and I think that should be table stakes. But then you have other levels like API documentation and class level documentation. I think that should be almost always, but you can get away with those. But then you have like guides, tutorials, examples like wikis and so on. Like that's not always necessary. Does that make sense?
Yes, a lot. I was actually caught on one of the points that you made about how if there is research done, then or how the decisions were made should be documented. So in this case, me coming from an agency rather than a one product startup, would you say like when an architect is creating the documentation for a greenfield project, would you say that the architect should make points about, like I considered this and that database and I chose XYZ database because it is gonna work faster with our clients' needs or whatever?
I do think that is really important. Yes. So those are the kind of things that you are not going to see from the code itself, right? Like that. Those are the things that and this doesn't have to be a document. This can be even in the code. So we at Facebook we have this like Facebook Workplace, which is kind of like an internal Facebook newsfeed. So like it can be anywhere where you have that is a searchable thing, but these decisions, if they are documented, this can help tremendously, and it's not a lot of time to actually capture these. All
right, works for me. You mentioned some tutorials and videos and documentations, and let's not forget about the most important one, human interaction. What, in your opinion, is the best way to share knowledge when helping a junior engineer develop their own coding skills?
Mm-hmm. So for me, one thing that I found that at Facebook is that junior engineers who join Facebook, they are extremely brilliant. They are really ambitious. They are really hungry. And the last thing they need is advice. And you can give them advice, but they want to make their own mistakes, and they want to like really get into it. And they are extremely brilliant. So like they cause me every time I'm supporting one, they cause me severe imposter syndrome, how good they are when I think back of my past and when I was 22. My advice there, like my main advice, let them code. Try to support them as much as you can to like actually be able to code and be able to like produce a ton of usable code. And I think that's probably the best advice that I can give. Try to give them like less risky projects, less things that are not necessarily easier, but things where like you don't need that much research, for example, and you can focus more on actual coding. There are a few things that you can do to help them, and there are a lot of things that like I don't know that like how they can learn to code faster. But I think the number one thing is let them code and code a lot. And some of the highest value extra bits that I found, one is code reviews, and not necessarily just code reviews on the code review system. Whenever possible, do these code reviews in person. Like sit down with the person and just go through the code. Let the person explain not just the code itself, but also like the thinking process and like their design process and everything. And then when like you are reviewing the code, don't just focus on the nits but also like talk about the whys and talk about like why wouldn't you consider a different approach to this? And so I think through a concrete code and through working through with a new person his own code, you can show a lot of tips and tricks that they wouldn't hear otherwise. It also like helps them to develop a better attitude for code reviews. I mean, when you first submit your code reviews, like this is a really personal thing and a scary thing, like people are going to critique your code. And when you are sitting with someone face to face, it's much harder to misunderstand the intentions. And you can really see that like the goal is for both of you to create the best possible code and not really to like, I don't know, say that your work is not good enough. It's really to find the best way. So code reviews, I think that's one of the really high value things. Similarly, design reviews. These are things like this doesn't have to be very formal. It's not like you need the junior person to come up with a design document or anything. It's just like whenever like he starts to get into coding or he has an idea how he should solve that, just sit down at the whiteboard for 10 minutes and just let them explain how they think of solving the situation. That again is like, with that you can give a lot of input, which they actually take without like unsolicited advice. I have another one, which is, so pair programming, I have to say, like I love pair programming, and I really enjoyed it when I was an engineer. For some reason, as an engineering manager, I was never able to advocate properly pair programming. There was always some kind of resistance from the engineers, which I kind of understand. So anyway, I do think that pair programming would be an amazing thing, but I do not have that much experience in that. However, joint problem solving, that is definitely something that can really speed up like someone's capabilities. So like, let's say you have a bug and then you sit together, two people, and trying to figure out like what caused the bug and how to debug that and how to follow through code and things like that. When you sit next to someone, look at their screen, look at what they are doing, you learn so much about like tips and tricks, how they use the tools and everything. And that's a super, super powerful thing. And do it with not just one person, try to do it with as many people as possible, because like everyone has different tips. You can pick up so many very useful things that way. And I think probably last thing is mentoring. If you have a good mentor and you develop that relationship, like getting advice from that person is going to be much more like you already have a respectful relationship. So getting advice for that person is easier.
All right. That was an exhaustive list. Thank you for sharing that. It's my next question is really kind of similar to this one. We talked about the junior engineer coming to your team. And now let's just talk about any engineer joining your team. What is the best way to get them up to speed with the knowledge of the company? You kind of mentioned that when you joined, the lack of documentation was actually useful in that I guess you made more human connections, even though it was a bit more difficult to actually get the hard facts. What do you think, or how do you think the best way of onboarding new engineers or sharing knowledge with them should be described?
Yeah, so the onboarding is actually like, yes, it is a tricky thing, but it's also like a huge opportunity to actually integrate the person really into the team. And when I design like onboarding for people, I always keep that in mind, and I always try to design it in a way that they have to interact with the team as much as they can. I have an example. Probably one of my favorite tricks. So we talked about documentation a bit, right? Like and how difficult it is to keep it up to date and everything. So one trick that I've tried, and I think it worked relatively well, is to let the new joiner write the documentation. This sounds really counterintuitive because like the new person doesn't have really context for anything, right? Like they did that. But I think it works really, really well. I mean, it requires a bit of pre-work, like the person cannot just start from zero. So like you need a table of contents and you need but let that person be responsible for either writing or making the documentation up to date. Because that way, like the person really needs to interact with the team members and really needs to ask all those questions. And the team has a checkpoint to make sure that this person really understands now how the system works, because like they can just check the documentation and then like they see whether that person really got what they explain. And this gives the person a really good excuse. So one of the difficult things when you are joining a new team, right? Like you are afraid, you don't want to bother people. Like they are busy and everything. Now you have a perfect excuse. Like this is your job and everyone knows that this is your job and you are doing something useful for the team. So you are not just bothering them for onboarding, you are bothering them because you want to make their documentation much better. So that's like, I really like this. That kind of worked for me. It's counterintuitive, but I think it works pretty well.
I love it.
Yeah, so that's a trick that it wasn't my idea, but it worked.
Is this how you guys onboarded at Facebook?
It's not Facebook. No. This was just my. So I did it at Facebook in two teams. I haven't tried it very much, but like I tried this twice and it worked, I think, really well.
Yeah, I love the idea.
Yeah. So the other things that we talked about, like I prefer active versus passive. So for example, having these kind of like small architecture reviews, just the team sits together, maybe not everyone, but like multiple people, and then going through in person, like with small lectures through the architecture. And the point here is not to make it really good quality. The point is specifically to keep it lightweight and to keep it more of a conversation. And this is why I think it's important for more people to be there from the team. It's really just like people chiming in. It's not someone giving a really polished presentation, but someone just like drawing on a whiteboard and explaining things. And then other team members jump in with details and things like that. That really shows the new person that like his questions are also relevant. He can also join the discussion. So with that, again, is not just reading about the architecture. It's really like, I don't know, understanding the system, understanding how things work and so on. One thing that I think it's pretty widespread at Facebook is when you have a new joiner, you always make an explicit, not request, but like expectations of them to question everything. And not just like ask questions where things they don't understand, but also like really question the decisions and question like all the assumptions and everything. They have a fresh eye, and that's like a really powerful thing. Like when people are for long at the team, they like take certain things for granted, and someone with a fresh eye can actually like really give very good input. But also like when you question certain decisions, like design decisions, then there is a good chance that you are going to learn a lot more about the team's decision-making processes, because they are going to tell you not just like how the system looks, but all the things that how we got here. So all the history and like what they considered and why they decided to go with this one. You might not agree with that decision, but it really gives you a very good glimpse into how the team thinks. And again, like pair programming or pair, like a lot of teams have on calls, for example, when like a person is for a week on call, so he or she replies to all the like support requests, and if there are bugs, they're reacting to that. So shadowing that on call, making that with the new person, that I found also that could be a very, very good way of like getting someone up to speed. Mm-hmm. So these are some of my tips.
The tricks up your sleeves.
Yes.
We kind of touched on this in just the last thing that you mentioned about shadowing someone and working together. And you talked a little bit about pair programming as well. And you opened up so on point when you said, you know, it's always going to be an extra expense to share knowledge. But what are your thoughts on clearing time in an engineering team's schedule for knowledge sharing, explicitly or implicitly?
Again, these are my opinions, but my gut feeling is that when you have to clear time for knowledge sharing, my gut feeling is that it's not going to happen. So like if you have a deadline and you have to like decide in the end like whether you write documentation or like finish like push your code to the deadline, it's not going to happen. I think what really can work is to make it part of your culture, like part of really the status quo. So like knowledge sharing is not something that you do as an extra thing. It's just something that like, this is how you operate. This is like, no one thinks about that. Like, okay, so we are doing that. This is kind of paying the price upfront. So thinking about like, we want to spend X amount of time in knowledge sharing, and these are the things that we think we should do, and then making that part of the culture. So what I'm thinking about is like, let's say we used to have these sharing sessions, for example, where like every week in the team meeting, someone shares something. Either there's something that they learned from the code base, or they have a bug and how they debug that and what they learned in the meantime, or just like something that they knew, something new that they learned. The key for this to work is to make it like very regular, very low cost to entry, and it's really part of the schedule. It's not really something that people decide that they are signing up for. Everyone, the person on call does it. This is table stakes. This is like not even thinking about it as an extra activity that you have to do, but it's just like part of your culture. Or the same thing as I told you, like creating an environment where everyone asks questions all the time, and everyone is like very welcoming on answering those questions. Like that again is something that really helps. But you can do this with everything. Like you can do this with documentation. Like if you think about your API and class documentation, for example, like if you leave everything to the last minute, then again, you might not gonna do it. But if you decide that this is like table stakes, this is something that is part of your process, then you can do that first and just do it as you go, and like don't accept commits to master that doesn't have like API documentation. Then it's part of your day-to-day, and this is like everyone is going to calculate it in. You need to make this part of your culture rather than like really consciously schedule or clear time for it. That's at least that's my experience with that. And this is something that I think Facebook does really well. So sharing is really part of Facebook culture, and not just sharing within the team, but also like outside the company. And I think this internal Facebook newsfeed, I mentioned that like the Facebook Workplace, it really helps about it, because like whenever you achieve something or you made a decision, you make a post about it, and part of that you get street credit for it. So like other people see it, they like it, like your name as an engineer grows. But it really helps with this like super open and really like sharing culture.
It almost sounds like you have to make it a ceremony like a ritual, like, you have a daily stand-up every day, and you have a retrospective at the end of your sprints, and you have a knowledge sharing session or whatever you want to call it every week.
Exactly. Like make it as easy and as possible, and like part of your like day-to-day as possible, I think.
Awesome. That puts it in a whole different perspective.
I think just like talking about this, like let's say talking about documentation, that's like, oh, and then you code it, and then you have to write documentation for it. That mindset, it's going to make it like more difficult to actually have that documentation.
So then we talked about writing and being active and making it a ritual. Do you have any tools that you would recommend that we use when we think about knowledge sharing?
So, well, I'm going to speak for home, and I already mentioned Facebook Workplace, but but I do think that is an amazing tool. So this is kind of like, imagine really Facebook for your workplace. Like you have your newsfeed, you have your groups and everything, and it works very surprisingly and incredibly well for a lot of things. For one, this is where like we are going to expand the scope a bit. So company-wide communication and learning about what other teams are doing and what the company doing is like Facebook Workplace is amazing for that. But even for teams, so teams usually have like these closed team groups. And we talked about things that we like should like document, for example, decisions that has been made. This is a perfect place for that. Like writing a post is a pretty low cost thing, and you can write the post easily, saying that like, okay, this is what I'm thinking about my design will be, and this is the decision that I'm thinking of making. And then other people can chime in by comments. And then you can have a discussion there, and then you can then follow up with a decision, like another post where you actually made the decision. So the very powerful thing here is that this is searchable. So a new person joins and suddenly wants to know about, like, I don't know, a decision that has been made and why was that. They can just search the group and go back and read the whole conversation, read even like who was pro, who was like against it. Like you can learn so many things about these things, and like documenting this is really powerful. Having these conversations on Facebook like newsfeed is also, it really helps with time zones. So we work with a lot of teams, sometimes 8-9 hours apart. So a chat thread doesn't always work because like it's at night or it's at so having these conversations more on an offline fashion where anyone can consume it when they want and then can chime in. I think it's also super powerful. So I think that's Facebook Workplace is not the only one. There are other products. I don't really know all of them, but I think having something like that is actually a very, very powerful tool. And then, of course, there is your chat or like Slack or anything that like more chat-like thing that's again is something that you should have. It's good for morale, but it's also good for other kind of decisions. And then you have all your like wikis and I think like for documentation, probably some kind of wikis or collaborative documents are the best tools. Coming back to Workplace, I do think that's probably one of the key reasons why the knowledge sharing is so good at Facebook is because like this system is designed to encourage you to post more and like to want to share what you have. And I mean, like all the likes and everything that just like helps you have that like high that like, oh yes, I shared it and 100 people liked it. That's awesome. So I do think that's a powerful tool.
Yeah. So it's like Facebook, except for work.
Exactly. There are a lot of other like I'm overly simplifying it. So there are a lot of other like functionality inside and lots of other things. Like we are using it as kind of a Stack Overflow. So each team, like a lot of teams, have a Q&A group where it's open and like people can post their like support requests, and there's a lot of like functionality and it works pretty well.
Right. Thank you. So as an engineering manager, how can you facilitate all this knowledge sharing within your team and your company? I feel like up to this point, we talked about the best case scenario. And I am sure you have had to encourage some of your team's members to be more upfront about sharing knowledge.
Yes, like my philosophy for that, I'm looking at usually at the long term. So again, I'm going to bring this back a bit to culture. And I don't think that I would pressure anyone to share more. I would look at the long game and I would try to make the culture more sharing-y, and that person will actually just like change in a few months to be able to share more. However, there are a lot of things that you can do. So like the question is like, how are you creating this culture, right? Like that would be the trick here. And there are a few like normal tricks here. Is like, one, reward it. I do think that like we work with really smart people, and people they are going to do the things that the company rewards, and reward doesn't have to be money all the time. Like that's not this is where, for example, like I talked about the number of likes. That is something that is actually like a reward. Or you can just like call out if someone is really like putting a lot of effort into sharing something, or like all these things, they can make a big difference. The second one would be like, make it fun. So writing documentation is pretty boring. Like preparing for like, I don't know, a big presentation, it's a lot of work. So try to make it as lightweight and I would say make it easy and make it fun. So like as lightweight as possible, and try to make it more like appealing. And I do have a fun story for that. So at Facebook, we have offices all over the world, and we are usually free to travel whenever we have a business reason. And people are pretty innovative of like figuring out business reasons. So so we had a team, and we were working a team in New York. We were based in London, and we were working in a team with New York. And both teams, we realized that we were struggling with analyzing the data really, really well. So one of my engineers came up with this, like, okay, so what if we go to New York and we create a data week where we like just all prepare with different like, it's basically like a week of learning, and we are going to do a lot of things like analyzing data together. So I'm pretty sure that the whole motivation was just to get a free week in New York. But in retrospect, that was the best week or the most useful week that we had for a long, long time. So like I've heard from years that, oh yes, we learned that in the data weeks, and that was just like, it was incredible how much the productivity of both teams skyrocketed after they had this 1 week. So make it fun. That was definitely a fun week. And I mean, like it was a huge amount of preparation that went into that, but people didn't mind because like it was for something. The other thing how you can make it more attractive. So for example, presenting on a team meeting, these sharing sessions. I think a lot of people wants to go more into like, I don't know, public speaking, or they want to improve their English. Like connecting it with that and connecting it with their goals, it's actually can be a very powerful thing. Again, this is a very low risk situation. You can practice public speaking with your friends basically, and like if it goes badly, nothing happens. And then you can just like encourage people to do more and more, so you can do more internal talks and bigger audiences and things like that. Right. And I think lastly, this is again something that is always true, lead by example. So like not just talk about like how important knowledge sharing is, but actually like show to people that it is important and why it is important, and like that you are also doing it, and explain that I'm sharing this because like it's important. This is what you are going to gain with that. Right. That's roughly my thoughts on this.
How fun. You can maybe make it fun even if you can't afford to fly your entire team to New York for a week. You can order some pizza and beer and have just a fun time together.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was an extreme example. So like you can really, there are endless things that you can do. I mean, like, yeah.
Right. So
there are much cheaper ways to make this fun. Yes, you're right.
So when you think about Facebook, it seems like you really have had a great experience with regards to knowledge sharing and having an open culture and basically being in a psychologically safe environment where asking questions is not only okay, it's encouraged. So what are the things that made knowledge sharing successful at Facebook?
I think we touched on this before, but I do think that it always comes down to culture, and I think that's where Facebook is really strong. It's really focused on a value-based culture, and it's really focused on scaling up that culture and really making sure that everyone lives and breathes that culture within Facebook. So part of this is the really openness. It's an extremely open environment. And open and transparent, and that was for me a big surprise, and it usually requires everyone a bit of adjustment. You are not used to people like coming to you and telling like, oh, you messed up here, but that's okay, and this is what. So it's a really open culture, and that helps with this sharing thing. It also helps with like, so this is true for the management also. It's really transparent, and this is, I think, why there are all these negative things in the press about Facebook and a lot of like controversy and things like that. But this is why I don't think that more internal morale really suffered for this, because like you always know what's the story internally, and you can just really double check that. Like you have your facts, like you have these like Facebook groups, you can just go and read the debate. Like it's not that Zach is saying that this has happened. Like you can go back to 2011 and read those posts. It's not like so internally this is like a completely different, like, because of this transparency. I think this helps a lot with everything. The other thing that's, well, maybe not unique at Facebook, but I think it's very strong is the culture is heavily based on communication. And I think like it changed a lot. So like as the company grows, you need to have more documentation. You need to have like, it's not going to be scalable that like you just talk with everyone all the time. Like that's, but it is still like heavily based on communication and human interaction. And it also helps a lot. That it's not just about like learning information, but it also making new connections and relationships, and that in turn creates more ideas and more collaborations and more. So like this is how the system works, and that's also powerful. Yeah, and the other thing is very pragmatic. Facebook doesn't have like, I don't know, prescribed processes and like you should have documentation for that. It's really pragmatic. It leaves like, the motto is like, hire smart people. We tell them what our mission is, and then they are going to figure out what to do. And that's like, every team works very differently, and every team does the practices that works for them, and it allows everyone to be very pragmatic. So I think those are the things that really helps within the culture. And of course, like there is Facebook Workplace, which I do want to emphasize again. I do think that actually like helps a lot to keep and create this culture.
Awesome. So if anybody is listening to us who wants to create a more open culture at their company, some of the things that you said were make it fun and make it easy, make it as easy as possible by creating a ritual for it in some sense, and really make it transparent and have people consciously agree to the fact that this is important and isn't separate from their regular everyday work.
I think that was a great summary.
Awesome. Thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this topic that we haven't touched on and you think is important to our listeners?
I think maybe one thing. So with this COVID and whole remote work situation, I think everything is changing, and at the moment I do not know how remote work will change what we've talked about. My gut feeling is that a lot of the things that I found useful, it's pre-remote work, and a lot of these like human interactions, and I think it's going to be harder and higher cost. So I am not sure how this whole thing will change, but I do think that it will significantly change how we'll work, and I think it will affect all the practices and everything around knowledge sharing also. So it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds.
Right. Perhaps we can view it as a new challenge that we just have to pragmatically overcome.
Exactly. I like that.
Awesomeness. Please tell me how our listeners could follow your work or get in touch with you if they want to follow up on any of these topics.
I do have a Twitter handle. I think probably that's the best way to do this. So I'm going to share with you my Twitter account, so they can DM me anytime. That's perfect.
All right, we will put it in the show notes. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really had this was an interesting conversation.
We are glad you could join us. And dearest listeners, thank you for staying with us till the end. Today, we talked about knowledge sharing and how it's not really a specific subject. It's part of our everyday lives, and we should make it part of our everyday lives. Thank you to Balázs for joining us today. You can find him on Twitter and follow his work, or you can reach out to Level Up Engineering on Twitter as well. Please share with us if you implement any of our tips and tricks. I am Karolina Tóth. I thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for staying with Level Up Engineering. If you enjoyed this podcast, so will your friends. Share this episode on your favorite social networking platform. To stay up to date with our content, follow Level Up Engineering on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.